There is a version of Ranni the Witch that most players think they understand, a cold, calculating schemer who wanted power and got it. And I am going to spend the next 3 hours convincing you that this version is a comfortable simplification of someone who is genuinely one of the most disturbing and radical figures in the entire land between. Because when you actually sit with what she did, why she did it, and what she is planning to do once you help her do it, you start to realize that Ranni is not just ambitious. She is closer to a being who has fundamentally rejected the terms of reality itself. And if that sounds like a big claim, then good, because I intend to earn it over the course of this video. But before we get into the deep end of lunar princesses and shattered fate and the true horror of what the Age of Stars actually means, let me ask you to do something for me. Drop a comment down below telling me where in the world you're watching this from, and what time it is right where you are, because I love seeing just how far and wide this channel reaches, whether you're watching this at 2 in the afternoon on your lunch break, or 4 in the morning because you can't sleep. I want to know, so type it out, say hello, and then settle in, because this is going to be a long and winding road through some of the darkest corners of Elden Ring's lore. And if you enjoy this kind of deep dive, then consider subscribing to the channel. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and it means more videos like this one get made. Alright, with that out of the way, let's talk about Ranni. To understand how someone becomes willing to do what Ranni does, you have to start at the beginning. You have to start with what she was born into, because nothing about Ranni's later choices makes sense if you don't first appreciate the sheer weight of expectation and tragedy that surrounded her from birth. And I want to start with her bloodline, because it is genuinely one of the most aghast heritages of any character in the lands between. Ranni, along with her siblings Rykard and Radahn, are born of Carian royalty, the powerful royal house of Liurnia that was able to stand toe-to-toe with the forces of Lindell in 2 separate wars. Think about that for a moment. An entire noble house with the military and magical might to challenge the Golden Order itself, not once, but twice. That is the family Ranni is born into. She is the child of Ranni, the great... No, wait. Let me be precise here. She is the child of Rennala, the great lunar champion of Raya Lucaria, and her father is the legendary archer champion Radagon. And in time, these children would also become the stepchildren of Marika through Radagon's second marriage, making them both Carian royalty and Golden Order royalty at the same time. And if you subscribe to the theory that Radagon and Marika have been sharing a body since Marika became a god, then in a strange sense, Marika was always part of their lives too. She would have been Radagon's other half during his entire marriage to Rennala, so from the moment of her birth, Ranni exists at the intersection of 2 of the most powerful bloodlines in the entire world, and that alone would mark her as significant. But there's more to it than that. Ranni is one of only 3 existing Empyreans in the entire narrative, alongside the twin prodigies Miquella and Malenia, and this is more impressive when you actually stop and consider the mechanics of how Empyreans seem to come about. Because Miquella and Malenia appear to have been chosen due to their auspicious birth, being born from the single-bodied Marika-Radagon union, they were, in a sense, destined for greatness by the nature of their conception. But Ranni shares no such special birth. She is not the product of that god-touched union, and so her selection as an Empyrean must be due to something else entirely, her own potential, her own power, something inherent to her rather than something bestowed upon her by circumstance of birth. And I think that distinction matters enormously, because it tells us that whatever the 2 fingers saw in her, they saw it in her as an individual, not as a product of divine genetics. And I want to pause here and address a theory that gets discussed a lot in the lore community. The idea that Ranni couldn't actually be the biological child of Marika because Empyreans are supposedly only born from a single god. And people cite Malenia's own remembrance as the source for this claim. And as a result of this theory, some believe that Ranni was instead born from the rebirthing of the Elden Beast. The rebirthing of the Amber Egg, and thus born solely from Radagon's meddling with that dark rite. And under this theory, the twin blades that surround Ranni in mythology and folklore would be seen as defective versions of that same rebirthing process. Now, I don't think this theory is necessarily impossible, but I do disagree with the underlying logic it's built on, the assumption that Empyreans can only be born of a single god. In my mind, Empyreans are chosen, that's the operative mechanism, and it just so happens that Miquella and Malenia were chosen because of their unique birth circumstances, rather than that unique birth being some kind of mandatory precursor for Empyrean status in general. And I think this reading is actually reinforced quite well by a translation of Ranni's own dialogue, courtesy of Loki, author of Abyssal Archive, who I want to thank right now for their translations and insights that have shaped a lot of my thinking throughout this video. And in this translation, Ranni talks about when she herself became an Empyrean, and I want to quote it now. She says, "I was once an Empyrean, for among the demigods only Malenia, Miquella, and I were discovered by our respective two fingers, and became candidates for the next generation of god to succeed Queen Marika. So it's ultimately up to you what you want to believe here. But if you want to go with Occam's razor on this one, I believe that Ranni is simply another biological child of Ranelagh and Radagon. And honestly, we have a naming convention clue buried right in the text that supports this, because we know how children's names tend to work in this world. They usually share the same first letter as one of their parents. Look at Godfrey's lineage, Godwyn, Godric, and Godfrey himself, all sharing that initial G. And in Ranni's case, all of the children of Radagon and Ranelagh carry an R as their first letter, Rykard, Radon, and Ranni. So ultimately I'll leave it up to you to decide your own truth on this one. But the practical result is the same either way. Ranni, regardless of the exact metaphysics of her birth, was raised as a Carian princess and was granted Empyrean status early in her life. We get scant details about Ranni's early life, but we do get some fragments, thanks to EG and a handful of other lore items and environmental details scattered throughout Liurnia. And much like her sibling Radon, it seems that in her original body, Ranni shared the iconic red hair of her father Radagon. And we get hints of this red hair on her original petrified body, the one found at the top of Liurnia's divine tower. And I think it's worth sitting with that image for a moment. A petrified, discarded body at the top of a tower, all that remains of the girl Ranni once was, before she chose to shed her flesh entirely. But before we get to that point in the story, it seems as though there was one genuine benefit to her Empyrean status in her youth, and that was the relationship she developed with her shadow-bound beast, Blade. Because we know from Malenia's remembrance, and from the Raging Wolf armor, that Empyreans are granted a shadow. For Marika it was Malenia, and for Ranni it is Blade. And Ranni does explicitly confirm that Blade was tailor-made as a vassal for her by the Two Fingers, as a direct result of her Empyrean status. And she says the following in one of her dialogues: "I was once an Empyrean of the demigods. Only I, Miquella, and Malenia could claim that title. Each of us was chosen by our own Two Fingers as a candidate to succeed Queen Marika, to become the new god of the coming age, which is when I received Blade, in the form of a vassal, tailored for an Empyrean." Now, I've discussed the nature of shadow bone beasts in a separate lore video, so if you're interested in learning more about that particular topic, then I will link it below. But while Blade appears to be a tailor-made creation of the Two Fingers, and in a way, a permanent reminder of what Ranni was destined to become, it's clear that Blade had his own mind. He made his own decisions regarding Ranni, and it is clear that the two of them developed a very special bond that went beyond the simple mechanical relationship of Shadow and Empyrean. And EG actually gives us a genuinely touching insight into Ranni's childhood here. He says, Blade is, well, Ranni's stepbrother, in a manner of speaking. Ranni's mother, Queen Ranelagh, approved of him, and they played like siblings from childhood. They were always happy to have me tag along as well. So it seems as though despite Ranelagh being associated with the moon, and Blade being fundamentally a product of the Two Fingers, an outside force entirely, she still approved of him as a companion for her daughter, and it seemed as though the two of them played together as many other children would, almost like brother and sister. And I think this small detail explains why Ranni holds both EG and Blade so dearly to her heart even now. And in a way, it's genuinely nice to imagine Ranni having something resembling a normal and innocent childhood. Because stories like that are far and few between in the lands between. Most of the demigods and Empyreans we encounter have childhoods marked by trauma, isolation, or manipulation from the very start. So this small pocket of warmth, this image of a young girl playing with her wolf companion under the watchful approval of her mother, stands out as something almost precious in retrospect, especially when you consider everything that comes after it. Yet Ranni, as I've already mentioned, was also born into the Carian royal household, a house founded by Queen Ranelagh, whose power was centered entirely around the moon, and we learn of this house's origins through Ranelagh's own remembrance, which reads, in her youth, Ranelagh was a prominent champion who charmed the academy with her lunar magic. Becoming its master, she also led the Glenstone Knights, and established the House of Caria as royalty. So Ranelagh is not only the last queen of Caria, as Ranni herself calls her during Ranelagh's boss fight, but she is also the first, having been the one who established her household as a royal one in the first place. And Ranelagh appears to have been an attendant of Raya Lucaria, who rose to extreme prominence due to her affiliation with lunar magic specifically. And lunar magic seems to have been its own distinct branch of sorcery, one that we can assume was genuinely special to those at the Academy, because up until that point, the Academy mainly focused on glintstone sorceries, the more traditional starlight-based magic, and we can see there are certainly meaningful differences between the magic of the moon and the magic of the stars, due to the fact that a different shade of glintstone seems to align more closely with the moon, something we learn of via Rinnella's scepter, which reads, Magic Scepter of Rinnella, Queen of the Full Moon. The glintstone is known as Carrion Blue, enhancing full moon sorceries, and the description of Carrion Retaliation also makes it clear that while Caria is associated firmly with the moon, Raya Lucaria as an institution is mainly infatuated with the stars, so there's a clear delineation between two entirely different schools of magical thought here. And we can even see the heterodox nature of Caria's new school of magic via the Lazuli Conspectus Crown, which reads, Scholars of the Lazuli Conspectus study Carrion sorceries, a heterodox pursuit that views the moon as equal to the stars, so it's clear that Rinnella was the founding figure of this entire school of thought. And her mastery over this novel form of magic is precisely what catapulted her to champion status, and subsequently to the formation of the Carrion royal house and rulership over Raya Lucaria. She was even honored in paintings throughout Raya Lucaria alongside other notable sorcerers of the age. So given all of this, given that Ranni was raised in the Carrion household under such a preeminent sorceress as Rinnella, it should come as no surprise that Ranni herself would grow into such a formidable being, because Ranni is powerful enough to bend a dragon. Alexander, no wait, I need to be careful here. Ranni is powerful enough to bend a dragon to her will, one who respected her so much that it took a knightly oath to serve her dark moon as well, and the moon of course, is the defining partner to both Ranni and Rinnella throughout this entire story. We learned that Rinnella met her own moon as a young astrologer via the Stargazer heirloom, which reads, a talisman engraved with a legend of a queen. The young astrologer gazed at the night sky as she walked. She had always chased the stars, every step of her journey. Then she met the full moon, and in time, the astrologer became a queen. And this is genuinely fascinating to me, because it seems to closely mirror Ranni's own inauguration with her moon, which we learn about through Ranni's dark moon spell, which reads, the moon was encountered by a young Ranni, led by the hand of her mother Rinnella. What she beheld was cold, dark, and veiled in occult mystery. And it's almost as if Rinnella deliberately takes Ranni on a symbolic journey, so that she can encounter her own moon, much as Rinnella did in her own youth, a recreation of that first fateful meeting, if you will. And this does make a great deal of sense, given that Caria's power is so fundamentally tied to the moon. And if Ranni was ever meant to become queen herself one day, she too would need to learn to rely on the power of the moon just as her mother had before her. Now, I do want to briefly comment on the Carrion lineage, because there's some strangeness here that I personally find fascinating. And another quiet detail appears when you look at the way that lineage is described, and notice how oddly contradictory it is. Because I do find it a little strange that Rinnella is referred to as both the founder of the Carrion line, and yet simultaneously referred to as the last of the Carrion queens. This makes it seem like a brand new royal family, and an ancient one at the exact same time, as if they are some old and august royal house, and yet they've only ever had one queen. The family also feels remarkably small to us, consisting only of Rinnella and her 3 children, and yet we get plenty of textual evidence that talks about their long traditions and lineage, evidence that makes it seem as though Ranni is only the latest in a long line of princesses. Take the Carrion filigreed crest, for example, which reads as follows, an honor said to have once been awarded to Carrion knights, who served as direct retainers to the kingdom's princesses. Now there is only one princess, Ranni, daughter of Rinnella. Now there is only one princess. That phrasing leads us to conclude that there had been other princesses of Caria in the past, and given that Rinnella is the one and only queen of the House of Caria, then this would mean that Rinnella must have had other daughters at some point, and in all honesty, I'm genuinely unsure what to make of this. There's of course the possibility that Rinnella was married prior to meeting Radagon, and had a number of other children with some other unnamed consort. But what interests me even more is how this lore interacts with the Hill of the Three Sisters, which exists just behind Caria Manor. On this hill there are 3 towers, Ranni's Rise, Celia's Rise, and Rinna's Rise, and my presumption is that Celia's Rise is an adopted name, one meant to reflect its current master, and that it was once named after a sister. So could it be that Ranna, Ranni, and this unnamed 3rd sister were all daughters of Caria, and thus does the Carian filigreed crest refer to these sisters, specifically when it talks about princesses, plural. Rinna is a name that is essentially a derivation of Rennala, and given the way names work in Elden Ring, it would be logical to assume that Rinna is or was the daughter of Rennala, of course. A spanner is thrown into the works here when Ranni first introduces herself to the Tarnished as Rinna, a false identity meant to hide the fact that she is actually one of the most influential players in the entire lands between. However, to me this doesn't really discount the idea that Rinna was once a separate person, and that Ranni has simply taken on her name to hide her true identity from prying eyes. The location of the three sisters heavily implies to me that there were at least 3 princesses of Caria at some point, though I want to stress that this is purely my own speculation here. There's of course also the possibility that Rinna is actually the name of the Snowy Crone, Ranni's secret mentor, especially since one can find the snow set specifically in Rinna's Rise, and this would also make a strange kind of sense of Ranni's fake identity. She is literally pretending to be her mentor of old when she introduces herself as Ranni the Witch. There's also the possibility that this item description is simply poorly worded, and the impression we're supposed to walk away with is that the Carian royal house is an old one with many traditions, despite the fact that it's only technically had one queen, and thus by the time Ranni came around, the conventions and traditions of Carian royalty would have already been firmly established. And Ranni had the benefit of growing up within the household of a powerful and storied family, no doubt receiving a top-class education, and no doubt inheriting her mother's impressive sorceress powers, making her a very logical candidate for Empyrean status if there ever was one. What is most unfortunate about Ranni's story is that we are missing so much from her early days. Her relationship with the Golden Order in those formative years, her opinions on being an Empyrean, and whether she was ever happy to go along with it at any stage of her life. The facts we do have are these. Ranni grew up in the Carian household. She was once more humanoid, with red hair, and was granted Empyrean status early on in her life, growing up closely with Iji and Blide, before eventually being introduced to the Dark Moon by her mother. And now, obviously, this introduction to the Dark Moon is one of 3, in my opinion, pivotal moments that set Ranni on her ultimate course to becoming who she is by the time we meet her in-game. The other 2 pivotal moments being Radagon abandoning her mother, and Ranni's subsequent meeting with the Snowy Crone and her strange mentorship. So with all of that said, let us now discuss the nature of the Dark Moon, the occult, and her mysterious mentor, the Snowy Crone, because this is where things really start to get interesting. One thing that I'm sure most of you are already aware of at this stage is that Ranni's moon and Rennala's full moon are actually separate celestial bodies entirely, and in fact you can see them both at the same time. If you stand at the top of Moonlight Altar, you can clearly see the differences here in their appearance. Ranni's moon, the Dark Moon, is a lot darker, while Rennala's moon is the full moon, as we know via her epithet and of course via her signature spell, Rennala's full moon. And when you consider how genuinely impressive this magic is, and the fact that it draws its power from a completely different source than that of Glintstone's sorcery, it is little wonder that Raya Lucaria would have fallen under its sway, and indeed. The description of the sorcery and its function tells us that it actually dispels other sorceries entirely, suggesting that moon sorcery may well be superior, or at least fundamentally more powerful than regular glintstone sorceries. And as a direct result of the prestige earned via her lunar sorcery, Rennala would go on to turn her entire family into a royal one. And as we've already discussed at length, Caria's power results directly from the moon, and thus it makes total sense that Rennala would want to introduce her chosen successor Ranni to her own moon in turn. Another interesting aspect about this tradition is that we need to consider the matriarchal nature of the Carian family and their unique relationship to the moon. For it is Rennala who rules as queen, and it seems to be understood that Lunar Princess Ranni would be the next in line, as the filigreed crest gives more importance to princesses specifically and their role within Carian society. We don't really hear much about the role of princes within the Carian royal family at all, and in a prior video I spoke on what I saw as another distinctly matriarchal society, the Nox Society. And the reason I see that society as matriarchal is due to the Night Maidens, a female-only class that appears to have been given special prominence within their culture, to the point where they are appointed as personal guards in the form of swordstresses. But why is this the case? Why do the Nox and the Carians both seem to be structured around matriarchal lines? Well, there are actually many crossovers between Nox society and Caria, including literal pieces of archaeological evidence that show Nox statues within Carian structures. Like in the Church of Vows, however, The main connection between the two seems to be their shared association with the celestial. With the moon specifically, Rinola and the Carians have the full moon, Ranni has the dark moon. And the Nox were once in contact with the black moon as well, as we learn of via the Moon of Noxtella talisman and the Memory Stone item descriptions. And in symbology more broadly, there is a common interpretation that the moon is associated with the feminine, while the sun is associated with the masculine, for example. The philosophical concept of yin and yang reflects this very idea. Yin means moon or female, yang means sun or male, and there is obviously far more nuance to that philosophy than just that simple binary. Ultimately, it's a philosophy of balance, of opposing forces existing together in a system of harmony. And there is, of course, the fact that the menstrual cycle used to be associated with lunar cycles in earlier human cultures, before science fully explained the biological process at play. And the idea that the moon is more closely associated with the feminine isn't a new idea within From Software's own games either. We of course have Dark Sun Gwendolyn from Dark Souls 1. Gwendolyn was the child of the god Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight, and by the time of Dark Souls 1. Gwendolyn is essentially the last remaining active deity in Anor Londo, City of the Gods. The description of his robes reads as follows: the power of the moon was strong in Gwendolyn, and thus he was raised as a daughter. And then of course we have the School of Mensis in Bloodborne, a name directly associated with the menstrual cycle, which is especially relevant given that game's heavy focus on childbirth and the moon as recurring thematic elements. And my point in bringing all of this up is that when it comes to From Software's catalog, especially Dark Souls, we have a clear precedent set where the moon is connected not only to feminine energy, but to magic itself. In Dark Souls 1, the moon is very firmly tied to Gwendolyn, Seath, and magic broadly, meaning that the yin of intelligence-based sorceries is balanced against the yang of the sun and its associated sunlight miracles and faith-based magic. So going into Elden Ring, myself, along with many other longtime Souls veterans, could see similar tropes being deployed once again. And so perhaps the reason the Nox and the Carians are both structured matriarchally is tied to some greater affinity that women are meant to have with the moon within this fictional cosmology, that they are simply more attuned to its power as such. Rinola led Ranni by the hand to meet her moon, not Rykard nor Radahn, because it was Ranni specifically who was meant to carry on her mother's legacy, and who was evidently next in line for the Carian throne. This is why particular mention is made of Carian princesses, and not princes. Yet there is something fundamentally different about Ranni's moon that separates it from her mother's. Each of the moons that we encounter throughout Elden Ring is given a specific and deliberate title, where Rinola is the full moon queen and her moon is simply the full moon. The bright white one that we all see in the sky above us, Ranni's moon is specifically named the Dark Moon. So let us read the second half of the item description for Ranni's Dark Moon incantation, which reads, "What she beheld was cold, dark, and veiled in occult mystery, cold, dark, and occult, all facets of its nature that appear to deliberately separate it from the full moon." And all three of these qualities are aspects that Ranni in time would come to fully embrace, and no doubt these qualities were a major factor in the rather dark path that she ultimately takes. Of course, her mastery over the occult and the cold would never have been possible if not for her mysterious mentor, the one we know only as the Snowy Crone. But when exactly did Ranni fall under the influence of this crone, and at what stage in her life? Well, to me it makes perfect sense that this would have happened during another pivotal moment in her life, the moment when Radagon abandoned her mother Rinola entirely. Pastor Muriel speaks of this perplexing event, and he says the following, however, when Godfrey, first Elden Lord, was hounded from the lands between, Radagon left Rinola to return to the Erdtree capital, becoming Queen Mareka's second husband and king consort, taking on the title of second Elden Lord. The mystery endures to this day as to why Lord Radagon would cast Lady Rinola aside, and moreover why a mere champion would be chosen for the seat of Elden Lord in the first place. So there came a moment when Godfrey and the Tarnished were driven from the lands between entirely, and Radagon would abandon Rinola and marry his own other half, Marika, in order to fill the sudden vacancy left by Godfrey's exile. This, in turn, made Rykard, Radahn, and Ranni stepchildren of Marika, but it would also completely break Rinola, and we learn of this via Rinola's own set description, which reads, "When Rinola, head of both the Academy of Raya Lucaria and the Carian royal family, lost her husband Radagon, her heart went along with him. And then those at the Academy realized that Rinola was no champion after all, and Radagon's importance to Rinola can of course be seen by the fact that a statue of Radagon remains in the Grand Library of Raya Lucaria. Close to where she herself remains to this day, Rinola appears completely broken, existing in a dreamlike state, obsessing endlessly over the amber egg rebirths in her own sweetings. This egg itself was given to her as a parting gift from Radagon, again explained to us by Miriel. In the end, Lady Rinola was left alone, cradling the amber egg Lord Radagon bequeathed her. Now she devotes herself to it through forbidden rite, the grim art of reincarnation you would do well to remember. Severing a vow, strongest of bonds, has consequences ever more dire. Radagon leaving has some far-reaching consequences for the Carian royal family as a whole. As we see in Rinola's set, Rinola's reaction to losing her husband is essentially seen as a sign of weakness by the Ryalucarians, a moment when they apparently decided that she was no champion at all, as if champions are only supposed to be people who have no emotional reactions whatsoever. The idea of a revolt by the Ryalucarians being directly triggered by Radagon abandoning Rinola is outright confirmed by Miriel, who says the following: the great and beautiful full moon witch, sadly, her heart was broken when Lord Radagon left her, and then, when the Academy rebelled against the royals, she was locked away in the Grand Library. So there is the trigger of the Ryalucarian rebellion laid bare. They saw Rinola's grief over the loss of her husband as a moment of weakness, and they struck at the Carians, locking Rinola away in the Grand Library, where she remains to this day, until we eventually meet her there ourselves. No doubt the Ryalucarians had been planning this for a while already, and this was simply the opportune moment to act. And we do learn that the Carians were preparing for the Academy's revolt via the Carian retaliation weapon art itself, so perhaps tensions had been boiling over for quite some time already. Perhaps Rinola marrying someone from the Golden Order was seen as a gross betrayal of everything that Ryalucaria and Liurnia had traditionally stood for. And we know that following this revolt, the Ryalucarians and the Carians would go to war, culminating in the siege of Caria Manor, an event we learn of via the sword monument just outside the manor itself, which reads, "The resting place of the contemptible cuckoos, lost in the siege of Caria Manor." And we also get some more details from E.G. himself, a blacksmith to the Carians who may well have witnessed these events firsthand. When the Ryalucaria Academy turned on the Carians, the Knights of the Cuckoo descended on this tract after leveling it. They carried on to the manor, the Guardians were taken off guard, but their strength had not waned, and they repelled the Knights' onslaught by conjuring an enchanted snare that remains potent to this very day. So we can only imagine how Ranni, a princess of the Carians, would have personally viewed this entire chain of events. Not only did she effectively lose her mother to grief and then subsequent imprisonment, but she watched her family lose all prestige and control over the Academy, and ultimately come under direct military attack from those who were once considered loyal Carian vassals. So all of this, all of the tragedy that Ranni's family suffers in the wake of Radagon's departure, exists because he essentially chose loyalty to the Erdtree over his own family. To Ranni and her siblings, it would have looked like he was simply choosing the Elden Throne over their family bond entirely, a choice that brought absolute ruin to their house and unbearable grief to their mother. And it's no wonder then that Rykard and Ranni, 2 out of the 3 children from this marriage, would go on to become 2 of the most antagonistic figures toward the Erdtree Order in the entire game. So for me, this moment, the moment when Ranni effectively loses her mother, this would be the ideal narrative moment for her to meet a brand new mentor, the Snowy Crone. And we learn of this character via the Snow Witch set, which reads as follows. Once worn by the Snowy Crone, who the young Ranni encountered deep in the woods, she was a witch, well versed in cold sorceries. It is said the doll that houses Ranni's soul was modeled after her. That old witch was Ranni's secret mentor, and I've always found the description of this crone truly fascinating. Especially the term crone itself, and her specific placement within the woods. Clearly the writers are playing up the classic witch of the woods trope here, with the term crone conveying the image of an old, gnarled witch. These are the classic tropes one reaches for when writing about the darker side of witchcraft and the occult, especially when we consider that the Snow Witch Hat itself considers this type of magic to be heretical. And for me, this is precisely where Ranni learned the darker aspects of magic from, the very magic that she would later wield to devastating effect during the Night of the Black Knives. Clearly, this Witch of the Woods was an adherent of the Dark Moon herself, and in my mind there is no doubt whatsoever that she helped form Ranni's entire worldview, and informed her of the dark path she would need to walk in order to bring about the Age of Stars. And in an immediate sense, the Snowy Crone clearly embodied the cold aspects of the Dark Moon, not only because of her name, but because of the frost incantations that she personally taught Ranni. And we learn of this through spells like Glintstone Ice Crag and Freezing Mist. And what is clear is that the cold is intrinsic to the very form of the dark moon, as it seems that Ranni herself exudes some kind of physical cold. For when she inhabits her miniature doll, the item description for that doll reads that it gives off a pleasant cool, and after she departs this vessel. The chill is described as being entirely gone, and there's also the fact that Blade appears to be personally affected by Ranni's cold. As his armor set states, the pelt serves as a cape. Protecting from cold, Blade was the blade of Ranni, but the cold bothered him anyway, and again to me this suggests that the reason there's cold present at all is because Ranni, now a devoted adherent of the Dark Moon, physically exudes a type of cold wherever she goes. And Ranni also mentions the cold in the Age of Stars ending directly. She refers to the chill night, and to me the cold and the chill of her Dark Moon is meant to represent the cold of the cosmos itself, the cold of the abyss of deep space, however. What interests me even more is the occult nature of the Dark Moon specifically, and what it means for Ranni's story as a whole. There are a few other mentions of the occult throughout Elden Ring, and it is essentially a weapon affinity strongly associated with death and the manipulation of vital energies. For example, it is associated with the weapon art Lifesteal Fist, Spectral Lance, Assassin's Gambit, and of course the Black Flame Blade, which applies the occult affinity to weapons directly, and we can get a solid idea of what the occult is really all about by reading the description of Lifesteal Fist, which states, a skill that demonstrates mastery over the art of controlling vital energies. So this is fundamentally a life manipulation-focused practice, which I suppose isn't much of a surprise for those familiar with the term occult. Witchcraft that is about life and death quite often carries the implicit understanding that you require a blood sacrifice or a death in order to access those powers, and we see this idea of blood sacrifice play out directly in the weapon art Assassins. Gambit, an occult weapon art where one is literally required to offer some of their own blood through a self-inflicted wound in order to take advantage of this occult power. As I suggested in my Night of the Black Knives lore video, Ranni speaks of how she used a fearsome rite to imbue the Black Knife Assassin blades with the power of the Rune of Death itself. And I have no doubt in my mind that this was an occult practice, an occult rite learned via the Snowy Crone, and an aspect of the Dark Moon's power more broadly. After all, the murder of Godwyn's soul, and the ridding of herself of her own Empyrean flesh, is very much a manipulation of life and death in its purest form, and to me it firmly earns that occult title, the heretical Snowy Crone. Playing up to the Wicked Witch of the Woods archetype really does tie into the darker side of witchcraft and the occult, much like the 2015 film The Witch, which I highly recommend, by the way, if you enjoy a slow-burning horror film. And I therefore think that the occult aspect of the Dark Moon was precisely the aspect that provided Ranni with the knowledge and rights necessary to manipulate the Rune of Death in the specific ways that she did. When it comes to the dark aspect of the moon, as mentioned by both Ranni and E.G. when they talk of the dark path of the Empyrean that Ranni is taking, I think it is a general representation of what Ranni's moon fundamentally represents. It represents the cold abyss of space. It represents the yin to the Golden Order's yang, the dark to its gold. It is not necessarily evil in some simplistic moral sense, but it is fundamentally and irreconcilably opposed to the path laid out by the Two Fingers. And thus it is, quite literally, the dark path of the Empyrean. And to make a long tangent short, I think Ranni was first introduced to the moon by her mother, but it was the crone who taught her the deeper mysteries of the dark moon, of the cold, of the dark, and of its occult aspects. And the very fact that Ranni makes her new body in the image of the Snowy Crone shows just how much of an impact this character had on her. She was a mentor to Ranni in every meaningful sense, meaning that everything Ranni is today owes an enormous debt to the teachings of the Snowy Crone, and ultimately, I believe it was the Snowy Crone who put her on this path in the first place, who told her what she needed to do in order to bring about the Age of Stars. So with that said, let us now talk about Ranni's designs, and the Night of the Black Knives itself. And this is where things get genuinely dark. I'll obviously start this chapter by making it clear that I've already done an in-depth look at the Night of the Black Knives in its own standalone video, so if you're interested in a fully comprehensive look at that specific subject, then I will link it below. But in this video, we'll mainly be looking at the effects that this event had on Ranni. Having grown a deep and personal hatred for the Golden Order, and resenting the Two Fingers for stifling her self-determination at every turn, Ranni's mentor would have given her the teachings necessary to realize her true destiny as an instrument of the Dark Moon, and to bring about an age of stars, and as such, the conspiracy known as the Night of the Black Knives would have begun to be. Formulated long before we ever see its consequences play out on screen. And in my Night of the Black Knives video, I discussed how the Black Knife assassins were women who were close to Marika in terms of blood, given that Crazier describes them as scions of the Eternal City, and that their armor set describes them as being close to Marika specifically. And as Loki says in a tweet I've referenced before, I've always believed that this means these are women close to Marika, both in terms of society and in terms of actual blood relation. However, Tarnished Archaeologist, in one of their own lore videos, has a fascinating and honestly more refined interpretation than my own. One that may explain why these women were close to Marika in a way I hadn't fully considered. In a series of videos, Tarnished Archaeologist lays out a theory that the Eternal Empire, the one belonging to the Eternal Cities, actually preceded Marika's civilization entirely, and that it was from this Eternal Empire that Marika's Golden Order society eventually evolved. Tarnished Archaeologist likens this process to the evolution of the Roman Empire from a pagan empire into a Christian one, and in this case, it was the Eternal Empire evolving from a paganistic, star-worshipping empire into a monotheistic tree cult that eventually emerged as the dominant Golden Order religion we see today. And that these three eternal cities we find scattered throughout the game actually once sat on the surface world, dominating the lands between, connected by the very highway that runs from Limgrave all the way to the Altus Plateau. And according to Tarnished Archaeologist's theory, the Black Knife Assassin Knights were the result of a counter-revolution. One waged by those who still believed in the old ways of the Eternal Empire, and who revolted against the emergence of Marika's new monotheistic religion. That is the long and short of it. Tarnished Archaeologist has an excellent series on this very subject, backed up by environmental details and in-game lore, and if you want to learn more about this particular theory, then I will link it below as. Well, and props to Tarnished Archaeologist for bringing out genuinely new ideas and theories this long after the game's original launch. This theory would explain quite elegantly why the women of the Black Knife Assassins were close to Marika. They were, in a sense, the same people as her, sharing that same ancient lineage. Regardless of whatever you personally think about the origins of the Black Knife Assassins, it is clear that Ranni was able to find a group of co-conspirators who shared her animosity for the Erdtree Order. And my impression and speculation here is that both sides brought something essential to the table in this grand plot. Firstly, the Black Knife Assassins obviously brought the martial skill and the physical participants who were willing and able to actually carry out the killing itself. I also believe that it was the Night Sorceries of Celia, assassin-focused skills that included magics of obfuscation, that formed the building blocks for what would eventually become the assassin's iconic cloaks, if you will. Invisibility magics built specifically for this purpose. However, I believe it was Ranni who brought her mastery of the occult to the conspiracy, and it was Ranni who was responsible for the Black Knives themselves. And by that I mean the actual physical weapons, as we've already discussed. Ranni was initiated in occult practices. And then she speaks of a fearsome rite in which she forged these very knives. I stole a fragment of the Rune of Death, and used it to forge the gods slaying black knives through fearsome rite. I did it all. And clearly, Ranni was able to bring her knowledge to bear, to provide the weapons needed to actually kill the gods. And of course, what's a fairly well-known fact at this point in the game's community history is that the ritual performed on Godwyn and Ranni simultaneously was specifically designed in a way that would benefit Ranni exclusively, that would rid her of her Empyrean flesh, cheating the system, so to speak, by taking one half of death, the body's death, without being obliterated entirely. Without having her soul killed alongside it, the curse mark of death reads the following: a scar carved into the discarded flesh of Ranni the Witch, also known as the half-will wound of the centipede. This curse mark was carved at the moment of death of the first demigod, and should have taken the shape of a complete circle. However, 2 demigods perished at the exact same time. Breaking the curse mark into 2 separate half-wheels, Ranni was the first of the demigods whose flesh perished, while the Prince of Death perished in soul alone. Specifically, the Rune of Death appears to have been carved at the exact same moment into the flesh of both Ranni and Godwyn, so that the effects of the Rune of Death would split, killing Ranni's body only. And Godwyn was forced to bear the death of soul entirely on her behalf. The clear and specific nature of this ritual shows quite plainly that Ranni planned this night primarily to rid herself of her own Empyrean flesh, an intent that is made explicitly clear by several of her own dialogues. I stole the Rune of Death, slew mine own Empyrean flesh, casting it away. and I believe this was Ranni's central aim in organizing and masterminding the Night of the Black Knives, and that she essentially misled and betrayed the Black Knife assassins by deliberately obscuring the true purpose of the ritual and leaving them out to dry in the aftermath of the night itself. This is why we find Alecto imprisoned by Ranni, and why the Black Knives appear to attack her vassals in retribution afterward. But for more detail on why I believe this to be the case, I would again refer you to my dedicated Night of the Black Knives video, and in general it seems like the Black Knife assassins take the full weight of the blame in the years that follow. As Ranni does not seem to be widely known as the true mastermind behind the plot in the modern era, it takes Rozier considerable investigation to even discover this connection, and aside from that, she is never really mentioned as the mastermind behind this entire plot by anyone else. Yet while Ranni's own objectives in organizing this night are fairly clear to us now, there are other general political goals that the night achieved as a side effect, and in my Black Knives video I believe I did a decent job of drawing attention to an article from Bandai Namco that was published alongside the December 2021 story trailer. This article was essentially a flavor piece intended to introduce players to the world of Elden Ring, and what they could expect from the overarching story, complementing the story trailer that released at the same time. And it said the following: On the night of the Black Knives, one grim night in the depths of winter, a flock of unknown assassins stole across the lands between in a treacherous attack. This foul covenant snuffed out the lives of many of the God Queen's kin throughout the Empire. Too numerous and too scattered for her godly protection to save, the assassins' targets were multifold, but none was more devastating a loss to the Eternal Queen than that of Godwyn the Golden. After his death, the Elden Ring was somehow shattered, and the order of the world broke along with it. The assassins' targets were multifold, and this foul covenant snuffed out the lives of many of Marika's kin. So while Ranni clearly had an ulterior motive in enacting this entire plan, it's clear that the conspiracy also achieved other aims that resulted in a truly devastating blow against the royal family of the Golden Order. So in a way, Ranni manages to kill two birds with one stone here. She harnesses the frustrations of those who resent the Erdtree Order to create a counter-revolutionary strike, one that not only achieves her primary goal of shedding her Empyrean skin, but also destabilizes a rival branch of the royal family entirely, striking a blow that the Golden Order essentially never truly recovers from for the rest of the story. Following this, Ranni clearly exists in some kind of spirit or soul form, before eventually anchoring her spirit within a brand new doll body. And now, at this point, I would like to take a moment to discuss Ranni's new form, and assess exactly what we see of her in-game, to see what bits of lore we can actually mine from her physical appearance. Because I think there's more going on here than people give credit for. So firstly, there's the blue spirit form of Ranni that sticks out of the side of her doll body, and I've always presumed that this is the true Ranni, her actual spirit. This is her in soul form, existing exactly as she does now that she has no flesh remaining, which of course makes sense when you consider that Ranni's mouth. Her spirit form and her doll form all move at the exact same time, meaning this is genuinely just Ranni's own spirit. It just happens to overlap slightly with the doll that she now possesses and controls. However, despite this, people have also often tried to tie Ranni and Melina together as connected figures, and there are certainly legitimate reasons to do so. For example, when Ranni first gives you the spectral steed whistle, she says she has been asked to do so by Torrent's former master, and clearly Melina is in spirit form as well, much like Ranni, describing herself as burned and bodiless. As pointed out by Ranni the Witch in a recent video on Melina, which I will link below, all three of Melina, Ranni, and Torrent fade away in a burst of blue particles. And given that Torrent is described in the spectral steed whistle item text as a specter, it's fair to assume that all three of these figures exist in some sort of shared spirit form. So for me, the first and most obvious connection between these two characters is simply that they both exist without corporeal bodies. And we could go a little further down that rabbit hole if we consider the theory that Melina could actually be the Glomide Queen. I personally am in the camp that believes Melina's most likely identity is that of the Glomide Queen, who has now been reborn as Marika's agent. Ranni was killed and disembodied by the Rune of Death, and the Glomide Queen once wielded this exact same power before being defeated by Malekith, perhaps Melina, the Glomide Queen. Being burned and bodiless herself could be a hint at her ultimate fate at the hands of Malekith, the wielder of death and the Rune of Death, who burned her alive in red-black flames. This is all wild speculation, of course, but in summary, I believe that if there is any genuine connection between Ranni and Melina, it's simply because they are both spirits who came to be through similar circumstances. I don't personally believe that they are literally the same person, nor do I believe they are sisters, and while there are surface-level similarities between the two, I believe they are two clearly distinct characters walking their own separate journeys. That being said, Melina deserves a video in of herself, and I will eventually explore the possibility that they are one and the same person in a separate dedicated video, so look out for that down the line. But tangent aside, in short, I believe that Ranni's overlapping ghostly form is literally just that. It's simply Ranni's spirit made visible to us. Now, when it comes to the physical form that Ranni has chosen for her puppet, as we've already mentioned, it is modeled after the most influential person in her entire life, the snowy crone. I believe the crone more or less wore this exact type of outfit, and that's why Ranni's appearance in general is said to be modeled after her. Yet I don't think this is a complete one-to-one recreation of what the snowy crone actually looked like. The fact that the crone is referred to as such doesn't chime particularly well with Ranni's actual appearance, as the term crone literally means an old woman. Yet Ranni's puppet is clearly far more youthful, given that it looks very similar to Ranni's own spirit form. So my conclusion here is that the youthful aspects of this appearance are based on Ranni herself, and that she's modified the snowy crone's original appearance slightly, to more closely reflect her own spirit and identity. Yet the most fascinating aspect of her appearance, in my opinion, remains her extra pair of forearms, possibly one of the most iconic parts of her entire design. And many of you will of course recognize the obvious connections this has to Hinduism. Many Hindu deities, like Brahma and Vishnu, have more than 2 arms. But why? Well, firstly, it helps illustrate that these beings, these gods, are simply not human. That by looking at an image of them, you realize straight away that this is a god. But to go a bit further, these extra limbs are symbols of divine power. My understanding is that multiple arms are used to show that these gods are able to perform multiple actions throughout the universe simultaneously, using all of their different arms at once, a divine multitasker, if you will. And the arms can also be used to illustrate different items of significance related to that specific god. For example, take Ganesha, who has 4 arms. His bottom right hand is positioned in a flat palm symbol representing a blessing, representing the blessings he bestows upon people, and in his top right hand he holds an axe, meant to represent detachment, or the severing of ties. You get the picture. So let's apply this same logic directly to Ranni. In our first and last meetings with her, her hands are positioned in a normal, relaxed way, and so there isn't a great deal we can mine from that particular pose, however. What interests me far more is the positioning of her hands when we speak to her at Ranni's rise, and the iconic hand gesture she makes throughout the story trailer. I'm of course referring to the pose where one of her pairs of hands is distinctly steepled together, and we have to ask, what is this trying to convey? Well, usually this specific hand position is used to depict thinking, planning, or scheming, and Ranni is, without question, a schemer. The brewing of the Age of Stars ultimately represents the combination of centuries worth of careful planning. There's nothing inherently wrong with a well-laid scheme, and to me her 2 sets of hands represent exactly this duality. She is a multitasker, one who is capable of active, immediate action, symbolized by her free set of hands. But one who is also always planning ahead, looking toward the future no matter what is happening in the present moment, symbolized by her steepled hands. It symbolizes Ranni as a master planner. And it makes me think of Mephala from the Elder Scrolls, who is also depicted with multiple arms. And Mephala is a deity of scheming and secret plans. That is, of course, my own speculation. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this in the comments below, what you personally think Ranni's extra 4 arms are meant to represent. With all that said, we now know what happens after the Night of the Black Knives. Godwyn becomes the Prince of Death, and gives rise to those who live in death. Possibly the greatest single instance of collateral damage in any Souls game to date. And as I've said in multiple videos now, I see the crime committed against Godwyn, his death of soul, and the fate he is forced to suffer, purely so that Ranni can achieve her own aims, as a genuinely terrible crime. Never mind the condemnation of countless other innocent people who are forced to live in death as a result of the death rot spreading outward from Godwyn, the very source of this terrible affliction. And so no matter what you personally think about Ranni's eventual ending, I always try to bear this in mind. The steps she has taken to get here are extremely ruthless, and I want to be clear. I'm not saying that she is a villain in some cartoonish sense, but in my eyes, she is far from a straightforward hero either. But what happens to Ranni after all of this? Firstly, we know that it is only after Ranni has disposed of her flesh that she divulges her plans to Aegean Blade, thanks to a piece of dialogue from E.G. When Lady Ranni renounced her flesh and chose the dark path of the Empyrean, E.G. and I swore allegiance as vassals, so this actually makes both E.G. and Blade rather innocent of any direct involvement in the Night of the Black Knives itself, as it seems they didn't know her true plans until this exact moment, yet Ranni and her vassals appear to have remained in hiding for quite a while afterward, as we do get a rather interesting piece of dialogue regarding Ranni's whereabouts from Rogier, who says the following: "I have some idea of Ranni's potential whereabouts. There's a manor to the north of the Academy of Raya Lucaria. It is the familial home of the Carian royals, from whom Ranni descends. There's been talk of the old royals' vassals gathering there in recent years. Ranni's whereabouts since the Shattering are a well-kept secret. She hasn't been seen even once, but I suspect she might have returned to the manor in which she was born, the Shattering." Of course, came after the Night of the Black Knives, however, from Rogier's dialogue. It's clear that Ranni really hasn't been much of an active player at all ever since the Night of the Black Knives and the Shattering War began in earnest. We of course learn via Gideon Ofnir that Ranni then set aside her Great Rune entirely. And now this is interesting for a number of reasons. First, it means that she did claim a Great Rune at some point in her past, as we know this is an action taken by all of the demigods. From the very introduction to Elden Ring itself, Marika's offspring, demigods all, claimed the shards of the Elden Ring. My speculation is that she did initially claim a Great Rune for the same reasons that everyone else did: raw power, and then, upon the outbreak of the Shattering War, she deliberately set hers aside and vanished, leaving her siblings to destroy one another while she waited patiently to enact her own plans, following the eventual end of the war, at a time when many of her potential rivals would have already been eliminated, and in general providing a much quieter landscape for her to enact her plans undisturbed. And the setting aside of her Great Rune is very symbolic to me. To me, it really does represent that Ranni sees her path, the dark path of the Empyrean, as fundamentally separate from that of the Elden Ring itself, while others may be hoping to claim the Elden Ring for their own purposes and harness its power through the Great Rune that they hold. Ranni's path is detached entirely from the existing order of this world, and as such, Great Runes, mere remnants of an order that she seeks to supplant entirely, really are detached from her concerns. Her dark path of the Empyrean does not require a Great Rune, nor would it benefit in any way from taking part in the Shattering War. Returning to Rogier's dialogue, he also talks about Ranni's vassals gathering at Caria Manor, the implication being that this is a fairly recent activity, occurring after years of the manor sitting abandoned and Ranni being entirely missing. The overall impression is that Ranni essentially skipped town while the Shattering War played out in full, and only recently following the end of that war has there been renewed activity at Caria Manor, and this brings us to the here and now, and Ranni's next step in her grand plan, severing the bonds between herself and the Two Fingers for good, and then finally, at the defeat of the Elden Beast, being able to herald in the Age of Stars at long last, yet despite Ranni's return, and the fairly exhausted state of all the other demigods by this point. Her plans remain locked in stasis, thanks entirely to the actions of her own brother, General Radahn. At this stage in the lore, we all know the general shape of Radahn's story. A great warrior who learned gravity magic simply so he could continue to ride his beleaguered horse. Yet he became so powerful in its usage that he imposed his will on the stars themselves during the Starscourge conflict. According to a sword monument found in Caelid, this was done to keep Celia safe from something, either from its own fate or from a direct threat posed by the stars. However, with the movement of the stars now arrested, fate itself is tethered along with it, and as we learn from Seluvis and E.G., this means that Ranni's own destiny is also held in stasis, indeed. Whether Radahn intentionally meant to prevent Ranni's plans or not is genuinely unclear. However, it is clear that he is currently the single greatest impediment standing between Ranni and her ultimate goal. The Dark Moon itself appears in the sky, uncovered, upon Radahn's eventual defeat, as if serving as an omen that Ranni's destiny can now finally resume its course. So with Radahn finally defeated, with the stars once again free to move as they were always meant to, Ranni's path forward is clear. But before we get into exactly what that path looks like, I want to sit with something for a moment, because I think it's genuinely remarkable, if you stop and think about it, that Ranni's entire plan, this century-spanning scheme that required the murder of a god, the betrayal of her own co-conspirators, the abandonment of her title, her Great Rune, and eventually her own body, was held hostage for years by her own brother's horse problem. And I don't say that to be flippant. because I actually think there's something quietly devastating buried in that fact. Ranni is without question the most patient and calculating figure in the entire narrative. A woman who is willing to wait out an entire war rather than risk her plans. And yet for all of that patience, for all of that careful maneuvering, she was still, in the end, at the mercy of forces entirely outside her control. Radhan didn't even know he was doing it. As far as we can tell, he wasn't trying to spite his sister, he was trying to save Celia, or defy his own fate, or simply hold on to Torrent a little longer. And in doing so, he accidentally became the single greatest obstacle standing between Ranni and everything she had worked toward. And I think that tells us something important about the nature of fate within Elden Ring's cosmology more broadly, that even a being as removed from ordinary constraints as Ranni, someone who has quite literally shed her own flesh to escape the destiny assigned to her, is still bound by the actions of others, still vulnerable to the world's chaos. And maybe that's actually central to why she wants to escape this system so badly in the first place. Because if even she, an Empyrean, a schemer of the highest order, can be stalled for years by an accident of her brother's making, then what does that say about the nature of fate itself? Is it truly a grand design at all? Or is it simply a tangled, chaotic mess, dressed up in the language of gods and prophecy to make it seem more intentional than it actually is? And I think Ranni's answer to that question, whether she'd phrase it this way or not, is that fate as currently constructed by the Two Fingers and the Golden Order is a lie, or at the very least a cage, one she intends to break entirely. So let's actually talk about what breaking that cage means, because I think this is where a lot of casual players get lost. The Age of Stars gets thrown around constantly in Elden Ring discourse as this vague, almost aesthetic concept, cold, distant, moon and stars imagery, very pretty, very evocative. But what does it actually mean, mechanically and philosophically, for Ranni to become the new god of this age? Well, let's start with what we're explicitly told, because Elden Ring, true to form, gives us just enough to build a coherent picture if we're willing to piece it together carefully. Ranni tells us directly what her ultimate goal is. Should the Tarnished choose to become her consort and complete her questline, she says, "I intend to leave this place, the lands between, and all its gods then, together, you and I shall build a kingdom of our own. One that exists beyond the powers of the Two Fingers, a kingdom where the destinies of men are not decided for them." And I think that final line is the thesis statement for her entire character. A kingdom where the destinies of men are not decided for them. This is not a woman seeking power for its own sake, or at least not primarily. This is a woman who has looked at the entire cosmic structure of her world, the Golden Order, the Two Fingers, the Greater Will, the concept of predetermined fate itself, and concluded that the fundamental sin of that structure is the removal of choice. And I want to dwell on that for a moment, because it reframes everything we've discussed so far. Her murder of Godwyn, her betrayal of the Black Knife assassins. All of it becomes, in her own mind at least, justified by this larger goal. The goal of freeing not just herself, but potentially all of humanity. From a system where an external force decides who lives, who dies, who becomes a god, and who remains nothing. But here's where I think it's worth being precise, because it would be easy to walk away from that quote thinking Ranni is some kind of liberator figure, a revolutionary fighting for the common person's right to self-determination. And I don't think that reading survives contact with the rest of what we know about her, because the method by which she intends to achieve this freedom is not persuasion, not uprising, not some grand democratic movement against the Golden Order. It is godhood. She intends to become the new god of a new age. And I think that's a genuinely important tension to sit with. Here is a woman whose entire stated philosophy is that destinies should not be decided for people from without, and yet her solution to that problem is to personally seize the exact kind of cosmic authority that allows destinies to be decided from without. She isn't dismantling the machinery of fate, she's proposing to operate it herself, under new management. And whether you read that as hypocrisy, or as a kind of tragic irony baked into the character, or simply as the only logical path available to someone raised entirely within a framework where godhood is the only currency that matters, I think is genuinely up for debate. And it's one of the reasons I find her so much more interesting than a simple girl boss archetype, or a simple villain archetype. She exists somewhere much murkier than either of those readings would suggest. So what actually happens, mechanically, if Ranni succeeds? Well, we get our clearest window into this through her ending sequence itself. Assuming the Tarnished chooses to pursue her questline to completion, and I want to walk through this sequence carefully, because I think the visual and textual details here are doing a lot of heavy lifting that's easy to miss on a first playthrough. At the Cathedral of Manus Celis, we witness Ranni severing her connection to the two fingers entirely. This is depicted through a genuinely haunting scene. Her spirit form withdrawing, her doll form collapsing, and Fia, interestingly enough, is the one who performs the actual physical rite alongside the Tarnished, plunging a blade into Ranni's discarded doll, which I think is a detail worth pausing on, because Fia, the deathbed companion, a being whose entire existence and philosophy is built around embracing death rather than escaping it, is the one chosen to help sever Ranni from her fate. There's a thematic resonance there that I don't think is accidental. Fia represents an alternative rejection of the Golden Order's structure, not through ascension to godhood like Ranni, but through radical acceptance of death and decay, and having her hands physically involved in cutting Ranni's cord to destiny feels like the game quietly drawing a line between these two different philosophies of rebellion, one that flees upward and outward into the cosmos, and one that burrows downward into the earth and the grave. Following this severing, we witness Ranni's spirit ascend to the Astel-esque destined death encounter deep beneath the Moonlight Altar, the worm-faced guardian of that realm, and once that guardian is defeated, we finally return to Ranni, now restored to something resembling her true form, still doll-bodied, but clearly changed, no longer bound to the fate the two fingers had marked out for her. And it's here that she delivers her final proposal to the Tarnished, the invitation to leave the lands between entirely, and build that promised kingdom beyond the reach of the Greater Will. And if the Tarnished accepts, we get the Age of Stars ending itself, and I think this ending is one of the most visually and tonally distinct of all the game's conclusions. The world is cast in cold blue light. Stars scattered impossibly across a black sky, and Ranni, now seated upon a throne of her own making, presides over a realm that feels genuinely alien compared to everything else we've seen throughout the lands between. Gone is the gold, gone is the Erdtree's looming presence, gone even is the sense of a shared, grounded reality. What we're left with is something closer to a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, depending on your read of it, a realm built entirely on Ranni's own terms. And this is where I want to bring in the comparison I've been building toward for a while now, because I think Ranni only really comes into focus when you set her directly against Miquella, the other great architect of a rival age in Elden Ring's in-game content. Because on the surface, these two figures look like they might be doing similar things. Both are Empyreans. Both reject the existing order of the Golden Order and the Greater Will. Both intend to found something new in its place. But the philosophy underpinning each of their projects could not be more different. And I think this contrast is genuinely one of the most interesting pieces of thematic architecture in the entire game. Miquella's Age of Compassion, as we come to understand it through the Shadow of the Erdtree expansion, is fundamentally a project of control through love, or perhaps more precisely, a project that cannot distinguish between the two. Miquella seeks to build a world where suffering is eliminated, where his own charm, his own irresistible compassion, becomes the governing force of reality itself. And the horror of Miquella's arc, as many have pointed out, is that this compassion is not actually a choice extended to others, it's imposed. It's a charm spell weaponized at a cosmic scale. Everyone who falls under Miquella's Age of Compassion does so because they have been made to. Their capacity to resist has been removed, and so paradoxically, an age built on the promise of removing suffering becomes an age that removes the very faculty of choice that would allow anyone to reject that promise in the first place. Ranni's project, whatever its flaws, whatever hypocrisies you might reasonably locate within it, is not this. Her stated goal, again, is a kingdom where destinies are not decided for people, and crucially, her method of achieving her own ending requires the willing participation of the Tarnished. She does not charm you into compliance. She does not remove your capacity to say no. She asks, quite literally at the end of her questline, whether you will accept her hand, whether you will choose to leave the lands between and help her build this new kingdom. And I think that distinction, the presence of an actual choice, however narrow, however constrained by the linear structure of a video game questline, matters enormously when we're comparing these two visions of a post-Golden Order world. Miquella represents freedom through the total abolition of pain, achieved via the total abolition of consent. Ranni represents freedom through the total abolition of predetermined fate, achieved at least nominally through the preservation of consent, even as she seizes godhood to do it, and whether that makes her more trustworthy than Miquella, or simply better at hiding the same fundamental will to power beneath a more palatable philosophy, is something I genuinely go back and forth on, and I'd love to hear your own thoughts on that particular question down in the comments. I also think it's worth bringing Millennia into this conversation briefly, because she represents a third and quietly tragic alternative to both of these paths, where Miquella seeks to eliminate suffering through control, and Ranni seeks to eliminate predetermined fate through her own ascension. Millennia simply endures. She carries her rot, her scarlet bloom, without ever attempting to escape the framework that produced her suffering in the first place. And I think this is why her story reads as the most purely tragic of all three siblings and near siblings. She isn't fighting the system the way Ranni is. She isn't trying to rewrite the terms of reality the way Miquella is. She's simply bearing the weight the Golden Order handed her. Generation after generation of Empyrean flesh rotting from within, and never blinking. And I think Elden Ring is deliberately inviting us to weigh these three responses to cosmic suffering against one another. Rejection and reconstruction in Ranni's case, forced universal compassion in Miquella's case, and stoic endurance in Millennia's case. And none of the game's writing suggests that any one of these is the correct answer, which I think is precisely the point. This is a story that refuses to hand you a clean moral framework. It simply shows you three Empyreans, three different responses to the exact same inherited trauma, and lets you sit with the discomfort of not knowing which, if any of them, got it right. Now I want to shift focus a little here, because so far we've spent most of our time on Ranni herself, on her philosophy, her cosmology, her family history. But I think it would be a genuine disservice to her story if we didn't spend real time on the people who orbit her, because one of the things that makes Ranni's arc so quietly devastating, when you actually sit with it, is how completely she is willing to use the people who love her. And I don't think that's too strong a word. I think love is genuinely the correct word for what Blade and EG feel toward her. And I want to start with Seluvis, because I think he's actually the most revealing figure in Ranni's whole support cast, precisely because he's the one who seems, on paper, the most loyal, and the most willing to do absolutely anything for her sake. Seluvis is a puppeteer, a sorcerer obsessed with the crafting of servile puppets, and his own dialogue makes his devotion to Ranni explicit. When we first meet him, he tells us that he was once tutored by Ranni, and calls her his one and only lady. And I think it's worth noting the specific texture of Seluvis's loyalty here. Because it isn't the warm, familial loyalty that Blade or EG display, it is something closer to obsession, something closer to worship. Seluvis speaks of Ranni with a kind of covetous reverence, and his own questline, which involves manipulating the Tarnished into essentially becoming complicit in the creation of a puppet meant to seduce and control Ranni. Meant to seduce and control another character entirely, reveals a man who has learned some deeply troubling lessons from his mistress, the puppeteering of consent, the reduction of another being into a servile instrument shaped entirely around someone else's desires. And if you choose to punish Seluvis for his scheme, which the game explicitly allows and in some sense encourages you to do, Ranni's own reaction is genuinely chilling in its coldness. She simply thanks you for it and moves on. There's no mourning, no hesitation, simply a brief acknowledgement that a problem has been dealt with. And I think that single moment tells you more about who Ranni actually is, beneath all the philosophy and the cosmic ambition, than almost anything else in her questline. This is a woman who is capable of discarding even her most devoted servants the instant they become inconvenient, or the instant their loyalty curdles into something she can no longer make use of. Compare that to how she treats Blade, and the contrast becomes even sharper, because Blade's fate throughout the story is one of the more quietly tragic threads running through the entirety of Liurnia. We learn that Blade was tasked by Ranni with hunting down and dealing with a rogue finger reader, Sorcerer Rogier's associate, or more specifically, we learn that he's meant to seek out and kill the two fingers themselves, in service of Ranni's plan to sever herself entirely from their influence. But somewhere along the way, something breaks in Blade. His hunt consumes him, twists him. And by the time the Tarnished eventually finds him again, he has become something closer to a beast than the noble wolf knight of Ranni's childhood, snarling, feral, half-lost to whatever primal nature always lurked beneath his more civilized exterior. And I think this transformation is genuinely one of the saddest character arcs in the entire game, precisely because of how understated it is. We don't get cutscenes explaining Blade's descent. We simply piece it together through item descriptions and brief halting dialogue exchanges scattered throughout Liurnia and the Mistwood. A knight who loved Ranni as a sister, who played with her in the gardens of Kyria Manor as a child, who swore himself to her cause without hesitation. Slowly consumed and unmade by the very mission she assigned him, and when the Tarnished eventually confronts him, we're given the option to kill him, to put him out of whatever misery or madness has claimed him, and Ranni's own reaction to this, once again, is telling. She seems to accept it, almost matter-of-factly, as though Blade's fate was always a foreseeable cost of the greater project. And I don't think this makes her a monster in any simple sense. I think it makes her something scarier than a monster. I think it makes her someone entirely willing to burn through the people who love her most. Not out of malice, not out of cruelty for its own sake, but simply because her vision of the Age of Stars has become so totalizing, so absolute, that everything else, every relationship, every bond of childhood loyalty has been quietly subordinated to it. And then there's E.G., who I think occupies a slightly different role in all of this. Because unlike Blade, E.G. seems to have largely avoided direct entanglement in the more dangerous, morally compromising aspects of Ranni's plan. He exists instead as something like a caretaker, a groundskeeper of Caria Minor, tending to what remains of the Carian legacy while the world outside crumbles into war. And I've always found something quietly moving in the way E.G. speaks about Ranni and Blade both. His dialogue carries none of Solivis's covetous obsession, none of the tragic unraveling we see in Blade. Instead, there's simply a kind of weary, patient devotion. A sense that E.G. has made his peace with serving a cause he may not fully understand, out of loyalty to a childhood he clearly still cherishes. And I think E.G. functions almost as the emotional through line of Ranni's entire story, the one figure who remembers her, truly remembers her, from before all of this, before the Empyrean flesh was shed, before the Black Knives were forged, before the Age of Stars became the only thing that mattered. And I think that's precisely why his continued presence at her side carries so much weight, because it's a reminder, buried beneath all of the cosmic scheming and the god-slaying, that Ranni was once simply a girl playing with her wolf companion in a garden, under the watchful approval of a mother who loved her, and that somewhere in the doll body, in the cold blue spirit form, in the woman who coldly accepts Solivis's death and Blade's descent into madness, that girl is still, in some sense, present. So let's bring this all the way back around now, because I want to return to the claim I opened this video with, the claim that Ranni is not simply ambitious, that she is closer to a being who has fundamentally rejected the terms of reality itself. And I think we're now in a position to actually unpack what that means with the full weight of everything we've covered behind us. Because when you step back and look at the entire shape of her arc, from a Carian princess raised in relative warmth and privilege, to an Empyrean chosen not by circumstance of birth, but by some quality the Two Fingers saw in her alone, to a woman who watched her mother broken by grief and her family's house besieged, to a pupil of a heretical witch in the woods, to the architect of a conspiracy that killed a god and shattered the Elden Ring itself, to a spirit without flesh, patiently waiting out a war she refused to participate in, to finally the founder of an entirely new cosmological order built beyond the reach of the greater will. What you're actually watching is a slow, deliberate process of a person systematically stripping away every single constraint that the world has placed upon her, her body, her bloodline, her great rune, her fate, her title even. In the end, the very reality of the lands between itself, and I don't think there's another figure in Elden Ring who goes quite this far. Miquella rejects the Golden Order, but still operates within a fundamentally similar cosmic architecture. One god replacing another, one form of control replacing another. Malenia rejects nothing at all. She simply endures within the system as it exists. But Ranni rejects the entire premise, the flesh, the fate, the world itself, and proposes to simply leave, to walk away from the lands between and build something that isn't merely a new government under old cosmic law, but an entirely separate reality operating under entirely new terms. And I think that's ultimately the most radical thing about her, more radical than the murder of Godwyn, more radical than the shattering of the Elden Ring, more radical even than her willingness to burn through Blade and Soluvis in pursuit of her goal. Because all of those things, taken individually, are simply the actions of an unusually ruthless and unusually patient schemer, but the Age of Stars itself. The idea that you can simply refuse the entire cosmological framework you were born into, and build an alternate one from scratch, that is something closer to a philosophical assault on the very concept of a fixed singular reality. And I think this is precisely why her final line to the Tarnished carries so much weight. A kingdom where the destinies of men are not decided for them, because what she's actually offering isn't safety, isn't comfort, isn't even necessarily freedom in any conventional sense. What she's offering is exile from destiny itself, a cold, distant, uncertain existence beyond the reach of any god, any greater will, any predetermined narrative. And whether you think that's a genuinely liberating proposition, or simply a more elegant form of the same will to power that drives every other demigod in this story, I think is ultimately the question Elden Ring wants you to sit with long after the credits roll. And for what it's worth, I don't think there's a clean answer. I think Ranni occupies a space that the game deliberately refuses to resolve for us, somewhere between visionary and tyrant, between liberator and usurper, between the girl who once played in the gardens of Caria Menor and the cold, calculating architect of an age that may or may not ever come to pass. And I think that unresolved tension is exactly why she's remained one of the most discussed and debated figures in this entire game's mythology, years after its original release. I want to open a new thread here, one I only gestured at earlier when we were discussing the matriarchal structure of Carian society, because I think it deserves a full and proper treatment of its own, and that thread is the Nox, and specifically their own relationship to a moon entirely separate from either Renala's full moon or Ranni's dark moon, the black moon. And I think once you actually dig into what the black moon represents and how the Nox related to it, you come away with a much richer understanding of what Ranni's own lunar path means by comparison. Because these three moons, the full moon, the dark moon, and the black moon, are not simply reskins of one another. They are, I believe, three distinct philosophical positions on the same fundamental question. What do you do when the light of the Golden Order fails to reach you? So let's start with who the Nox actually were. Because for a civilization this consequential to the setting's history, we get remarkably little direct exposition about them. Most of what we know is pieced together from item descriptions scattered throughout Nokron, Eternal City, and Noxtella, Eternal City, the two ruined settlements we encounter beneath the surface of the lands between. And from what we can gather, the Nox were once a surface-dwelling people, until, in punishment for some transgression against the Golden Order, they were banished underground, forced to live out their civilization in darkness, cut off from the sun, from the Erd Tree, from the entire apparatus of Golden Order worship that structures life on the surface. And I think this banishment is the single most important fact to understand about the Nox, because everything else about their culture, their aesthetics, their magic, their relationship to the moon flows directly out of this original exile. They are a people defined by exclusion from the light, and so it makes a certain intuitive sense that a society formed under those exact conditions would eventually come to venerate something other than the sun, something that could still be theirs even in the depths of an underground city that never sees daylight. And that something is the Black Moon, which we learn about primarily through two items, the Moon of Noxtella Talisman and the Memory Stone. And I want to actually read both of these carefully, because I think the specific wording matters a great deal here. The Moon of Noxtella Talisman reads, "In the dark of the Great Cistern, a black moon once shed its light. But a betrayal robbed Noxtella of its treasured moon, and the Nox nobility began to lose their powers." And I think that word betrayal is doing a huge amount of work in that sentence, because it tells us that the Black Moon wasn't simply lost, or extinguished, or fell out of use the way a religion might slowly fade over generations. It was actively taken, stolen from them. And I think this framing recontextualizes the entire Nox civilization for us. They are not simply an exiled people who found a substitute source of power underground. They are a people who briefly possessed something extraordinary, a black moon that granted their nobility genuine power, and who then had that source of power ripped away from them through betrayal. Which means the story of the Nox is not one long, continuous decline from the moment of their banishment. It's a story with an additional layer of tragedy stacked on top of the original exile. They built something in the darkness, and then someone took that too. So who was responsible for this betrayal? Well, this is where the lore community has spent a great deal of time speculating. And I think the most compelling theory, one that's been advanced by several dedicated lore channels over the years, points toward Estelle, or more specifically, points toward the broader category of being that Estelle represents, the void-aligned entities we encounter in the lands between, because we know that the Nox eventually turned toward worship of the void itself. Worship of these star-devouring, reality-warping creatures that seem to exist in fundamental opposition to the natural order of the cosmos, as the Golden Order understands it. And there's a reasonable case to be made that the Black Moon and the Void are directly connected. Perhaps even that the Black Moon was itself consumed or corrupted by this encroaching Void influence, which would explain both why it vanished, and why the Nox civilization we actually encounter in-game feels so thoroughly saturated with imagery of the void, gaping stars, that oppressive sense of cosmic dread that permeates every corner of Nokron and Noxtella. This isn't simply an underground city. It's an underground city that made contact with something far stranger and far more dangerous than the Golden Order ever accounted for, and paid a steep price for that contact. Now here's where I want to bring this back around to Ranni, because I think the contrast between the Black Moon and the Dark Moon is genuinely illuminating, if you'll forgive the phrasing. Both moons exist in opposition to the Golden Order's dominant light-based cosmology. Both are associated with darkness, with the underground or the cold, with forces the Golden Order would classify as heretical or forbidden. But the Black Moon, at least as far as we can tell, represents a power that was ultimately stolen from its people, a promise that was made and then broken, leaving the Nox as a hollowed-out civilization, still practicing the aesthetic trappings of their old moon worship, still building their black knife assassins and their night sorceries, but without the actual source of power that once justified all of it. Whereas Ranni's Dark Moon represents something she was able to keep, something she cultivated deliberately across centuries of careful, patient effort, and never had stolen from her. And I think that distinction between a power lost through betrayal and a power secured through relentless personal agency is precisely what separates the Nox's fate from Ranni's fate. The Nox are a cautionary tale of what happens when your alternative to the Golden Order is itself vulnerable to being taken away, while Ranni represents someone who learned that lesson, consciously or not, and structured her entire life's work around making sure that whatever power she claimed for herself could never be stolen in the same way. She doesn't rely on an external source she has to protect. She becomes the source herself, shedding her flesh, severing her ties to the two fingers, until there's simply nothing left for anyone else to take from her. This actually gives us a good opportunity to circle back to something I mentioned only briefly earlier, tarnished archaeologists' theory about the Eternal Empire, and the Black Knife assassins being scions of that older, star-worshipping civilization. Because once you bring the Nox properly into the picture, that theory starts to feel a lot more textured. If the Eternal Cities represent the remnants of a pre-Golden Order civilization, one organized around the stars rather than the Erd Tree, and if the Nox represent an underground offshoot of that same broader cultural lineage, exiled and then betrayed even further by the loss of their Black Moon, then the Black Knife assassins start to look less like a random collection of disaffected women close to Marika, and more like the living remnant of an entire suppressed cosmology, one that predates the Golden Order and has been fighting a long, slow, mostly invisible war against it ever since, generation after generation, using whatever fragments of their old power still remain: night sorceries, invisibility magics, occult rites tied to death, and vital energy manipulation. And I think this is precisely why Ranni was able to find such willing co-conspirators in them. She wasn't simply recruiting disgruntled subjects. She was tapping into an existing current of resistance that had been running beneath the surface of the Golden Order's world for far longer than her own lifetime, a current with its own grievances, its own history of betrayal at the hands of that same golden light. And I think Celia deserves a specific mention here too, because the town of Sorcery occupies a really interesting position in all of this. We know Celia was a settlement dedicated to a particularly transgressive, heretical branch of sorcery, one associated with corruption and decay by the time we actually visit it in-game. The town itself has been rotted from within by scarlet rot, its sorcerers twisted into ashen remnants of what they once were. But before that decay set in, Celia appears to have been a genuine center of magical innovation, developing exactly the kind of invisibility and obfuscation magics that the Black Knife assassins would go on to use during their conspiracy. And I think it's worth asking why a settlement so heavily associated with unconventional, boundary-pushing sorcery would end up geographically and thematically linked to Radon's own story, given that Radon's entire arc revolves around protecting Celia through his gravity magic, freezing the stars in place specifically to shield the town from some fate tied to the heavens themselves. And I think there's a reading here where Radon, without ever fully understanding the cosmic stakes involved, was inadvertently protecting one of the last living vestiges of that older, pre-Golden Order magical tradition. The same tradition Ranni would eventually draw upon to forge her black knives, which makes his accidental obstruction of her plans feel almost poetically layered. He spent his life protecting the very well of power his sister needed, while simultaneously freezing the stars that would have allowed her plan to reach its conclusion. Two acts, both rooted in the exact same magical tradition, working in direct opposition to one another without either sibling fully realizing it. Now I want to slow down and actually separate out something I've been treating as a single unit so far, because I think it's a mistake, one that a lot of lore content makes, to talk about Nokron and Noxtella as though they're simply two entrances to the same underground civilization. They are not. They are two distinct settlements, with two distinct fates. And I think understanding the difference between them actually sharpens our picture of the Nox considerably. Nokron, Eternal City, is the settlement we access after defeating Starscourge Radon. It exists in a kind of frozen, suspended state, ash raining perpetually from a sky that isn't really a sky at all, populated by the remnants of a knight's cavalry and haunted by the looming, silent presence of the Fingerslayer blade waiting to be claimed. And I think what's crucial about Nokron is that it appears to have been the site of the original betrayal, the place where the Black Moon was actually lost, whereas Noxtella, Eternal City, which we access much later, deep beneath Ainsel River, following an entirely different questline thread tied to Ranni's own progression, represents something closer to the aftermath, a second Nox settlement, one built or perhaps simply continued after whatever catastrophe befell Nokron. And I think the presence of two settlements tells us something important. That the Nox, even after losing their Black Moon, even after the betrayal that robbed them of their treasured source of power, did not simply vanish as a civilization. They persisted, they rebuilt or attempted to, in a new location, carrying with them whatever fragments of their old cosmology and magical tradition still survived the loss. And I think Noxtella in particular gives us our clearest look at what daily life, or whatever passed for daily life, might have looked like for the Nox in their diminished state. Because it's here that we find the Cathedral of Manu Celis, an important location tied directly to Ranni's own eventual questline. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think the game is deliberately drawing a connective thread between Ranni's own path towards severing her fate, and this underground civilization's history of loss, rebellion, and quiet persistence. It's also in Noxtella that we encounter some of the clearest evidence of the Void's influence on Nox religious practice, and here I want to bring in the Fingerslayer blade specifically, because its item description tells us quite plainly what it was designed for. A dagger for the ancient rite of slaying fingers, that thing born to sever the guidance of fingers. And this, I think, is one of the single most important pieces of lore in the entire underground questline, because it tells us the Nox developed, at some point in their history, an entire ritual technology explicitly designed to cut beings free from the influence of the two fingers, the exact same two fingers, whose guidance Ranni herself is so desperate to escape. And given that Ranni's own questline eventually has the Tarnished retrieve this exact blade, and use it in the rite that severs her connection to the two fingers once and for all, I think we have to conclude that Ranni's entire liberation, her entire escape from predetermined fate, is only made possible because an ancient, betrayed, underground civilization spent generations perfecting the exact technology she would eventually need to complete her own rebellion. Which reframes her story once again. She isn't simply a lone genius who devised a wholly original method of escaping godhood's constraints. She's the inheritor of a much older tradition of resistance, one stretching back through the Nox. And possibly even further back, to whatever civilization first understood that the two fingers' guidance could be severed at all. I want to spend some time now on the actual inhabitants and defenders of these ruined cities, because I think the Knight's Cavalry and the Night Maiden enemy types easy to dismiss as simply another set of tough optional bosses scattered around the overworld, actually carry a surprising amount of thematic weight once you understand where they come from. The Knight's Cavalry are explicitly tied to Nokron, spectral horsemen who patrol the world under cover of darkness, and their item drops and general presentation strongly suggest they were once the martial defenders of the Eternal City. Cavalry who continued their patrol duties even after their civilization's collapse, trapped in a kind of eternal, spectral vigil, still guarding a city that for all practical purposes no longer needs guarding. And I think there's something genuinely haunting about that image. Soldiers so bound to duty, so bound to a role assigned to them by a civilization now reduced to ash and ruin, that they continue performing that role indefinitely, unable or unwilling to recognize that the war they're prepared for has already been lost. And I think this connects back thematically to everything we've discussed about fate and predetermined rules throughout this entire video. Because the Knight's Cavalry represent, in a sense, the opposite of what Ranni is trying to achieve. They are beings utterly consumed by the role assigned to them, unable to escape it even in death, patrolling forever, while Ranni represents the polar opposite impulse, the total rejection of any assigned role whatsoever. The Night Maiden, by contrast, gives us a much more specific and personal window into Nox society, and specifically into the matriarchal structures I touched on earlier when discussing the broader parallel between Carrion and Nox social organization, because the Night Maiden appears to have functioned as a kind of elite female bodyguard or attendant class within Nox nobility. And I think their design, their weaponry, their close association with specific noble figures reinforces the idea that Nox civilization, much like Carrion civilization, placed unusual emphasis on female lineage and female authority, and I think it's worth asking why this pattern recurs so consistently across the lore. Why the moon aligns societies of this world. Caria with its full moon and dark moon, the Nox with their black moon, keep organizing themselves around women specifically, and I've already offered one explanation: the yin and yang framework, the association between femininity and lunar, intuitive, hidden knowledge, as opposed to the more overt, martial, solar authority of the Golden Order. But I think there's a second explanation worth considering here too, and that's the idea that these lunar-aligned societies, precisely because they exist in opposition to or exile from the Golden Order, may have developed alternative social structures, specifically because the Golden Order's own structures, patriarchal, centered on Godfrey and Marika's male-led military conquest. On the male-led priesthood of the Erd Tree, on figures like Godfrey and Radagon serving as the visible public face of Elden Lordship, simply had no room for them, and so these excluded societies, the Carrions, the Nox, built something different almost by necessity, a structure defined in opposition to the one that had excluded them in the first place. And I think this is actually a really elegant piece of world building on From Software's part, because it means the very existence of matriarchal lunar societies within Elden Ring's cosmology isn't simply an aesthetic choice. Moon equals feminine, sun equals masculine. It's the direct logical consequence of the Golden Order's own exclusionary structure. The more rigidly patriarchal and solar the dominant culture becomes, the more its excluded fringes will naturally coalesce around an alternative, lunar, feminine-centered mode of organization, simply because that's the space left available to them. And I think Ranni once again sits at the absolute endpoint of this entire pattern. She isn't simply a princess of a lunar-aligned house. She is the culmination of centuries of excluded, alternative cosmological thought, finally given the power, the patience, and the ruthlessness necessary to act on it decisively.